In this video we want to talk about issues in unemployment, issues in the study of unemployment. Now this is an area that's covered extensively in the topic of macroeconomics. One of the objectives of government economic policy is to bring about full employment, or bring about a higher and sustained level of economic activity, which will require more workers and will bring about greater prosperity in the economy. However, there are issues associated with unemployment. There are ideas and theories and issues that we need to consider, and this will be the subject matter of this video. It will be carried on in other videos, and this is a topic that arises almost continuously when we talk about macroeconomic policy. So let's start. Let's talk about some of the key issues to start with. Well, first of all, we talk about the unemployment rate. Now, this is the percentage of the labour force without a job but registered as being willing and available for work. So the unemployment rate it's the total number of people in the economy who wish to have a job. And then we take the number unemployed as a percentage of that, and that is our unemployment rate. It takes the proportion of the population who have no work, who are out of work, and expresses it as a percentage of the total number of people who are available for work and who are willing to work. And that's what we mean by the unemployment rate. The labour force itself, well, this means it's the people holding a job or registered as being willing and available for work. That is the size of the labour force. The labour force is simply all those people who are working or who are registered as being willing and available for work. So that's almost the entire adult population. The participation rate, well, it's the percentage of the population of working age declaring themselves to be in the labour force. So the participation rate is the number of people who say they are a part of the labour force. How many people in the country of a particular age, working age, but say perhaps they're not a part of the labour force for whatever reason. They don't wish to be included. They're not registered for work and they're not working. So the participation rate is the number who are available for work and who wish to have a job. So the labour market should not be seen in static terms. First of all, we have the number of people who are working, and then we have the number of people who are unemployed. Of course, if you add those together, you're going to get the labour force. And then we have the people out of the labour force for whatever reason. We'll see what I mean by this in a moment. We have people outside of the labour force. So we have those people working, those people who are unemployed, and we have people who are outside. Now, people in the unemployed sector may move in to working because of more jobs being created and more people being hired to work. So that's happening continuously. Generally speaking, companies sometimes make people redundant, tragically, but other times they're looking for workers, and these are called new hires. They want people who are currently unemployed to come and work for them. But there are also, as I said, people who suffer layoffs and who are being made redundant and so on. So there is a constant movement between those people who are working into the unemployed sector and also people in the unemployed sector moving back into work. So there is a flow of people continuously between those two parts. There's also the out of the labour force, the people who are not classified as part of the labour force, perhaps people who for domestic reasons have left the labour force, perhaps to care for someone in their family or because of children or whatever, um, they may now want to re-enter the labour force and take a job. So they were previously outside of the labour force, but now they want to start participating in the labour force, so they take a job. But you also get people who are working who wish to temporarily take leave. Again, maybe for family reasons or some sort of domestic reason, or sometimes people just want to go travelling or have a break year or a gap year or something and just go away somewhere. But for whatever reason, you'd have people who are working who want to leave the working population and leave the labour force. As I said, maybe to look after someone in the family, or maybe they might leave for some issue associated with travel or whatever. So there's a constant movement of people between working and out of the labour force. We also have people who are unemployed and they just give up. They give up looking for a job because they can't get one suitable for them, so they become discouraged and they leave the labour force completely. They just stop registering as unemployed, they stop looking for work, they consider themselves to be outside of it. Sometimes it happens when people of a certain age, for people coming up to retirement age, who are currently unemployed, and they think they're not going to get a job anyway because of their age or because of conditions in the labour market, so they just simply stop looking. They're outside of the labour force. But you also get people who are outside of the labour force who re-enter the labour market and perhaps then register as unemployed as a first step to getting a job. So they register as unemployed, hoping to pick up work. So we see there are different parts to the labour market, and there's movement between these parts. It's not a static relationship, it's a very dynamic one. There's constantly people leaving the labour force to become, say, unemployed. They're outside of the labour force, I should say, and they want to join the labour force. So they register for work, they become part of the unemployed. The unemployed perhaps may go through periods of retraining, or they may simply be lucky to find work, and they enter the working population. People in the working population may temporarily drop out and become outside of the labour force because of family commitments. It's a whole series of issues that we need to consider which make the labour force dynamic. Now, the composition of unemployment. Well, different groups in society are more vulnerable to unemployment, and these vary by all sorts of issues. It's not necessarily based on any sort of discrimination. It could be based on skills or on work ethic or approaches to work. It can depend on many things. But for example, older people may find dealing with new technology quite troublesome. They may not have the skills to do it. So it's not ageism, it's not a rejection of them because of their age, it may be a rejection of them because of their skills, or maybe the perception of those people as having very few or very little, let's say, computing skills. It could be based on gender. It may be discrimination. It may simply be the fact that employers don't wish to go through some sort of investigation for discrimination and may imply certain proportions as male, female, or whatever. There are all sorts of issues. It may be simple discrimination. We don't know. It could be the region. Sometimes people living in certain areas may find it difficult to get a job. Sometimes people live perhaps in a very beautiful part of the country, but there's very little industry there. It's beautiful because there is no industry. Well, if they want to continue to live there, they're going to find it difficult to find work. Could be to do with ethnic origin. It could be to do with language skills or barriers, or perhaps the applicants find it difficult to work under the conditions of, let's say, pressing technologies, increasing technologies, because they haven't got training or background. Of course, then again, it could be simple discrimination. There are all sorts of reasons as to why various parts of the population may experience problems in finding work. Now, the types of unemployment, well, first of all, let's deal with what's called frictional unemployment. This is the irreducible minimum level of unemployment in a dynamic society. Unemployment can't fall below this amount. Every society will have unemployed. So it's impossible to have a society where every man, woman and child who is able and willing to work and keen to work at the going rate, where they'll have a job. There's always unemployment. There is a minimum level of unemployment that will always occur. This is called frictional unemployment. For example, people between jobs. People move between jobs. During the period when they're moving from job A to job B, they're unemployed. And in a free society, that will always happen. We'll always have people moving from one job to the next, experiencing short terms of unemployment. And sometimes in the literature it's called almost unemployed. It could be that people are moving region. Perhaps people are moving from one town into the city, or are moving from one city to the next. And in the course of moving, they're unemployed. These are called the frictional unemployed. There's nothing can be done about this. In free societies, this will always happen. So unemployment never falls to zero. There is a floor below which it can't go, and that floor is determined by what we call the frictional unemployed. We also have structural unemployment. Unemployment arising from a mismatch of skills and job opportunities when the pattern of demand and production changes. Well, we live in a dynamic society, a society which is constantly innovating and changing, and new products and new technologies, and traditional skills may no longer be sought. So traditional industries may go. For example, coal mining may no longer be popular. Shipbuilding may move to different countries, and so there's always a movement of industry from one place to the next, and some industries just simply become unwanted. The products are no longer required. And this leads to what we call structural unemployment. The people who worked for that industry have immense skills, but the skills are related to that industry, and that industry itself is going. So it takes time for workers to retrain. We have to take, let's say, coal miners and retrain them to work in areas that are currently in demand. Well, that's difficult. It's a whole retraining package, during which time they're unemployed. There's structural unemployment. There's also what we call demand deficient unemployment. Now, this is very much related to Keynesian economics. Keynes believed that the answer to unemployment was to create demand, and if people had more disposable income, they would buy more. If they bought more, there would be more demand for workers to make those products. So the solution to unemployment, according to Keynes, was to manage aggregate demand, manage the total demand in the economy. So demand deficient unemployment occurs when output is below full capacity, when the economy is running at under full utilization. There are idle resources. Idle resources could be factories standing still, machines not being used, resources not being used in that sense, but also workers not being employed. So the problem of demand efficient unemployment seems to be solved in the Keynesian framework, based on the work of John Maynard Keynes, published in 1936, The General Theory, as implemented after the Second World War by most countries who claim to be capitalist. And the idea was to regulate the amount of demand in the economy so that there would be demand for the output and hence a demand for labour. We say that labour is a derived demand. People don't demand the services of the workers for the workers' sake. They demand the services of the workers to make the products that are in demand in the society. And that was the Keynesian solution. Keynesianism lasted up to, difficult to say when, but the mid-1970s, when the monetarist school of economics seemed to take over. Keynesian unemployment occurs in the transitional period before wages and prices have fully adjusted. So it's Keynesian unemployment is when the economy is adjusting itself. It's moving from one, if you like, equilibrium to the next. It's moving from one state to the next. In that period, there's demand deficient unemployment. It could be that the government needs to cut taxes so people have more disposable income, or perhaps government expenditure needs to be increased to create demand for goods and services. And then there will be what's known as a multiplier effect throughout the economy. If the government starts the process by putting additional resources into the economy through government expenditure, let's say it borrowed to do this, it borrowed some money in the markets and spent the money on, let's say, building roads or building schools. If it does that, then there will be a demand for people to build the schools, but those people will have extra money and they will spend the money on products from other companies, and the other companies will then require extra workers because they have had an increase in demand as well. It's what's called the multiplier effect. It'll be dealt with elsewhere in other videos, but for the moment, Keynesianism is one way of looking at the causes of unemployment. Now, classical unemployment. And classical unemployment we associate with the period before Keynes to a large extent. This is created when the wage is deliberately maintained above the level at which the labour supply and labour demand schedules intersect. In this case, wages are too high. That's classical unemployment. Wages are just the price of labour. Like any price in any market, prices rise and prices fall according to conditions. But sometimes we don't want wages to fall. Trade unions, for example, don't want their members to be made worse off. So trade unions try to maintain the wage rate. Which means there's a rigidity in the system. Unemployment can arise because wages are inflexible. So if wages are too high, then the demand for labour may be less, and of course the supply of labour may increase because more people will want work because the wages are seen to be quite high. And the difference between the supply of labour, the people looking for work at that higher wage rate, and the demand for labour, the amount that industry really wants to pay and wants to employ at that rate, the difference between the two is what's known as classical unemployment. There's also seasonal unemployment in economies. We have seasonal workers, people who work, let's say, in the amusements beside the seaside. Well, in the winter, there's not a lot of demand for this, so these may be seasonally unemployed workers. Farm workers, in the harvest time, a lot of workers are required on farms. Outside of that, there's less demand. Um, so we have seasonal unemployment. Sometimes in the year there's a high demand for certain types of worker, other times there's no demand because of the seasons. So we have different types of unemployment that we need to be aware of. Now, a similar categorization is retained, but an important distinction is to be noted between voluntary unemployment. We still have our types of unemployment we just talked about, but now we need to distinguish between voluntary unemployment, which is when a worker chooses not to accept a job at the going rate. So it's voluntary. The worker knows what the going rate is, but refuses to work at that rate. That's voluntary unemployment. And we need to make this distinction with involuntary unemployment. When a worker would be willing to accept the job at the going rate but can't get an offer, can't find a job. That's involuntary. They're involuntarily unemployed because they can't find a job, but they are quite prepared to accept the going rate. They just can't find a job. So we have a distinction here between voluntary and involuntary unemployment. And we need to be aware of these. Let's look at supply and demand. And this time we'll have real wages on the vertical axis. Real wages is just what's known as nominal wage divided by the price level. That's the amount that the workers can buy, if you like. It's when they convert their wages, their nominal wage, the amount they get at the end of the week, when they convert that into real goods and services. So we divide wages by prices, by an index of prices. On the horizontal axis we have the number of workers. And we have three lines on this one. We have the labour demand, LD. Well, labour demand is downward sloping. It's similar to demand curves that we're familiar with in microeconomics. If the real wage is very low, there will be a high demand for labour because labour is cheap. So high demand. As wages rise, less demand for labour. And we have this AJ and LF. Well, AJ is the number of workers prepared to accept jobs. AJ, accept jobs. It's the number of workers who are prepared to accept a job. So at each wage rate, it takes the number of people, the number of workers, who are prepared to work at that wage rate. And LF is the labour force. It's the size of the labour force. In the long run, LF will be just a vertical line. It's the number of people in the labour force. So it's just a vertical line. But as in fact we've seen earlier, there are constantly people coming into the labour force and leaving the labour force, and some are in work and some are just opting out of the labour force completely for, as I said earlier, domestic reasons or whatever. So it's not actually a vertical line. It has this gradual upward slope. This slope, almost vertical, LF, but it's just gradually tapering off. It's just a slight gradient on the line. So at very high wages, I should say, simply more people want to join the labour force. At very low wages, people think, well, it's not really work, it's not worthwhile working, they're just going to opt out and be outside of the labour force. So there is a responsiveness between the size of the labour force and real wages. But AJ is the amount of people who will accept jobs at the particular wage rate. So if we take W star, then we've got N star, the number of workers who, at the point E, the number of workers who were willing to accept work at that wage rate. and at the point F, N1, we have the number of workers in the labour force who would be in the labour force at W star. Now AJ, the number who are prepared to accept jobs, that's to the left of the labour force, because some members of the labour force are between jobs, others are waiting for better offers. So AJ is always to the left of the labour force. The number of people who are willing to accept jobs is to the left because of people moving between jobs and people just waiting for better offers for employment. Now the distance EF is called the natural rate of unemployment. That's an important concept. It's the difference between what people are willing to accept at the going wage, the number of people who are willing to work at the going wage, W star, and the labour force, the total size of the labour force. So the number of people who are willing to work at W star, who will accept jobs at W star, that's the point E, compared to the total size of the labour force, which is F. And the difference between E and F is called the natural rate of unemployment, a very important concept. Let's talk about the natural rate of unemployment in a little more detail. The natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment between, when the labour market is in equilibrium. So if we just skip back here for a moment, you can see that the labour market is in equilibrium. Those willing to accept jobs at W star, well, demand and supply are equal. So it is in equilibrium. It's entirely voluntary. It's the people who are willing to work, willing to accept jobs at the going rate. And it's a comparison between the total size of the labour force and what people are willing to work, to accept the work. So the difference between the total size of the labour force and what people are willing, the number of people who are willing to work at that rate. So the difference between the two is voluntary. It includes frictional unemployment, of course, which accounts for the difference between the two curves we had earlier on. Structural unemployment as well. So if we go back here for a second and just look at this idea of classical unemployment using the same diagram. Here we see that, let's say the wage has now increased from W star up to W2. As a consequence, the demand for labour has fallen. It's now at the point A. Well, at W star you can see it was over to the right of A. So at W2, the demand has fallen to the point A. But the people willing to take work has increased. More people are willing to work at W2 because it's a higher wage rate, so it moves to point B. Suppose that union power succeeds in maintaining the real wage rate at W2. So let's say the trade unions, let's say, are in a strong position and they hold the wage rate at W2. Now equilibrium is at A, because that's what the wage rate is. The wage rate is at W2, so the demand will be at the point A. So at W2, that's the number that will be demanded. And unemployment is therefore AC. It's the total size of the labour force at the wage rate W2. So AC is the level of unemployment. Now of this AC, BC is voluntary Well, the number of people who are willing to accept employment at W2 is the point B. But they're not going to have the opportunity because the market will only take the point A. The demand is at A. So BC is voluntary simply because the wages are kept at the point W2. So BC is voluntary and AB is involuntary. There are people who would like to work at W2. The people at the point B, that number would like to work. They're willing to accept the jobs, AJ, willing to accept the jobs. But the market will not offer that many jobs. The market will only take A. The wages at W2, so the demand at W2 is the point A. So there are people who are involuntarily unemployed who would love to work at W2. Those are the difference between A and B. They would love to have a job, but they can't get one because the demand is less. W2 has restricted the demand for labour. The extent that this unemployment reflects a conscious decision by the unions to restrict employment, it's voluntary unemployment. So the issue is the increase in wages to W2. Let's say the trade unions managed to hold this rate because they want their workers to have their members to have more wages. So they'll hold the wage at W2. This means the demand will be at the point A. The point AB, that's involuntary unemployment. There are people who would love to work at W2, who would love to have a job, and they would be at the point B. That's the demand for work at W2. But you can see there's a difference. The market will only take A. The number up to point B would actually work. BC, well, BC is the difference between what people are willing to accept employment, that number, compared to the total labour force. And that is measured by the point BC. So those are some ideas about unemployment, about the difference between classical and so on, and this idea of the natural rate of unemployment, I should say. We talked about definitions of employment as well. Now let's move to a slightly different subject, and but very much related to what we're talking about here. And let's look at supply-side economics. This entails the use of microeconomic incentives, and these are used to alter the level of full employment. So we're talking here about microeconomic incentives to alter the level of full employment. For example, cutting taxation. If we cut taxation, people are willing to work more. If we cut taxation, entrepreneurs are willing to open more businesses or expand existing businesses. So clearly these microeconomic incentives affect the level of full employment. They affect the level of potential output. Let's say the example I just gave of cutting taxes. So let's say corporation tax means companies have more retained profits. They're better able to invest, grow, compete in markets, and have more employment, more output. So there's more potential output with this type of policy. It alters the natural rate of unemployment because it enables workers to find employment easier. So there's less voluntary unemployment. It means that there's perhaps even a bigger demand for employment. Workers are keen to have jobs. In the long run, the performance of the economy can only be changed by only by affecting the level of full employment and a corresponding level of potential output. So, in the long run, the economy must depend on these microeconomic issues. This is a view from the supply side. One famous approach to this, there are many different types of policies that relate to supply side economics, but one particular one springs to mind. It's known as the Laffer curve, L-A-F-F-E-R, the Laffer curve. And in this one, if the government, let's say, increases the taxation rate, there is less incentive to work. Now, government revenue will be dependent on the tax rate. So let's say the government has zero tax rate. That means the government doesn't get any tax revenue. So the government has zero. But if the government has a 100% tax rate, its revenue will also be zero because people will not work. So it's a question of finding the tax rate which maximizes the return to the government, which may not be 50%. It may be 10% or 20%, or it could be 60%. It depends. But the idea is the government can overtax, and by overtaxing it means government revenue falls because taxation rates are too high. It's in the interest of the government perhaps to cut taxes to generate even more revenue for itself, because people will work harder, more people will work because taxation rates are lower. There are all sorts of supply side policies we could look at. Trade union reform, for example. It's held by many supply side economists that trade unions were too powerful, they could call strikes too easily, there was a loss of output and damage to the reputation of the companies and to the country indeed. So trade union reform was seen as important. So reducing trade union power may limit distortions in the labour market. It could be an issue of training and retraining workers. It's important in today's world that the workers have high skill levels and that the skill levels are maintained. So good supply side policy would be to maintain the training within the labour force so that they are better able to compete globally as a supply side policy. And that will lead to perhaps more employment. Improve efficiency of the labour market, not just in terms of their skills, but perhaps all sorts of issues related to, for example, absenteeism, approach to work, professionalism, pride in the product they make, their application, as well as their training and skill levels. And these may affect frictional and structural unemployment. People moving between jobs will find it easier to pick up a job when they finally move. They may move location, not just move between jobs, but move from one city to the next. Again, they'll find it easy to find work because they have appropriate skills. It may also affect structural unemployment, where traditional industries are closing down, but the workforce are adequately trained and brought up to speed in terms of what was required by a modern industrial economy, so that the workforce are better able to get employment. Higher investment may increase the demand for labour, and this may be achieved via tax incentives or lower interest rates. So the government may try to promote investment by giving various tax allowances and tax breaks to companies who invest in particular areas. Another supply side policy which will help to create a demand for workers. A hysteresis, this is a lag of an effect behind its cause. Sometimes when a policy is implemented, nothing seems to change. It's much later something happens. The policy starts to take effect, takes changes. So when the government changes, let's say, taxation rates, nothing seems to happen immediately. Very little happens immediately. It's sometimes we have to wait. We have to wait for the effect to work its way through the economy to see what the effects of the policy are. So hysteresis is this idea of looking at the changes in something and then waiting for the effects to work through and seeing what happens. For example, a short-run fall in labour demand may lead to a permanent fall in labour supply. That's possible. Let's just look at a diagram to illustrate that. Let's say here we have the accept jobs and the labour force, the one we had earlier, and we have the labour demand, the blue line falling downwards. So we have labour force and accept jobs, if you remember from the previous diagram. Now let's say the demand for labour falls. Now it can fall for all sorts of reasons. It can fall because of improved technology or labour-saving technology, or it could fall because there's greater globalization and companies are moving overseas, or whatever reason. So let's say there is a fall in the demand for labour. Now, originally, with the original demand for labour, the labour demand 1, those willing to accept jobs, well, the equilibrium was at the point N1. That was the number of workers. Now, because of the fall in the demand for labour, the number of workers required is less. N2 is required. So that's fallen. So the number of workers required has fallen as a consequence of a fall in the demand for labour. Now, the problem here is that the fall in the demand for labour may lead to a permanent fall in labour supply. And what we need to do is just see, how can this work in practice? How can it be that when something happens, it takes time for it to come through? That policies don't just happen overnight. The changes don't happen overnight. The policy changes today and we see the change of the policy tomorrow. That doesn't happen. It takes a long time for it to work through. So a fall in the labour demand may lead to a permanent fall in labour supply. So the first channel that this could happen is called sometimes insider-outsider distinction. Only those in work take part in wage bargaining and they protect their own positions. The people in work, they protect themselves. And they're not that concerned about the people who are out of work. They may feel upset and petition their politicians and the trade unions to try and do something about the unemployed, because they do feel for it. But when wage negotiations is happening or are happening, they take themselves into account. They try to get their best deal for themselves. So it could be that when there's a fall in the demand for labour, then the people in work will protect themselves. They don't try to find work for the people who are out of work. They're looking at themselves. And that's held to be one channel, one reason why the fall in the labour supply may be permanent. People who are out of work get locked out of work. It's very difficult for them to join the labour force. If there's a fall in labour demand, sometimes people get frustrated and annoyed. They become discouraged, so they stop looking for jobs. People apply for hundreds of jobs and get no response. In the end, they give up. There's no point. Sometimes search and mismatch could be an issue. Firms and workers get used to low search. Sometimes the workers are looking for particular types of work or particular wages or conditions, and they have to search to try and find employers who offer this. And this may be a real problem, trying to find the employers. So there might be a time delay. The demand for labour has fallen. Now the search process to try and find appropriate employers that meet the requirements of the labour force, that becomes even more difficult. And also the capital stock. Low levels of investment in recessions lead to permanently low levels of capital. Sometimes when companies stop investing because, let's say, there's a recession, people are buying less of the product, or the conditions in the market are unfavorable, so companies stop investing. When they stop investing, they work with the existing capital they've got to try and get it as far as they can. And to that end, there is very little that the workers can do to try and find employment. So there is a temporary fall in the labour demand and a permanent fall in labour supply, because by the time the companies recover from the recession, they may have invested in new labour saving capital or in new technology. So investment after the recession may lock out workers from seeking employment because they don't have the skills to cope with the new equipment, the new requirements. So sometimes a recession can cause a break in investment, that the companies jump from one type of investment to a totally new, more innovative, more labour saving type of investment, and that can lead to a permanent fall in the labour supply. People take themselves out of the labour force because they think they don't simply have the skills to perform the tasks required by the new technology. So what we've looked at in this video is we've looked at unemployment from various perspectives. We've talked about issues in the labour market, the types of unemployment. We've talked about the leads and the issues associated with unemployment and the channels through which sometimes people can get locked out of the market, here in the latter part, the hysteresis. And the issues here are associated with the labour market and the adjustments that the labour market required to bring about full employment. And we can see from what we just said that it's a very controversial area. Some economists are split about the precise measurements of voluntary or involuntary unemployment. Some economists are perhaps split about the significance of structural unemployment or frictional unemployment or seasonal or whatever. So what we need to come away with, having looked at this, is just an understanding of these various concepts. There is no definitive answer. What we've done is simply classified types of unemployment, looked at issues which may cause unemployment, the idea of the natural rate of unemployment, and laterally we've looked at the significance of changes in labour demand and the impacts of those changes on the permanent levels of labour supply. So with that, let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.